Hello, Brobs. We're back with the 7 deadly sins, and we pick back up in chapter 6. Christopher Sykes, lust. Which page is this? 65. Lust. The recent permission to describe erotic activity with the aid of the bluntest words in our language, and in detail if so desired, does not make the subject of lust any easier to deal with. In fact, it makes it harder since most of these admired words are derisory, I'll venture to guess, and the movement to enlarge their currency weakens useful conventions. I shall stick to the conventions, nevertheless, opening in the style of the old-fashioned sermon. With an intercession, may I resist the awful temptation of hypocrisy and coyness. These temptations are not imaginary, nor confined to prim souls. Of the 7 deadly sins, lust is the only one about which all mankind, with very few exceptions, knows something from experience. People own to this awkward fact in general, but not in particular. Even in an age which prides itself on being outspoken, people usually remain careful to avoid any suggestion that they themselves are prone to unlawful passions or to the extravaganza which goes with erotic feeling. Hence, a great measure of falsification is in most writing and talk on the subject, even in the most advanced society. But to say, lust is a vice I cannot understand would be to overdo it. It would not wash in any society at all. Hence the flight from hypocrisy to coyness. All men are potentially lustful, and a huge proportion are so in practice. This raises the great question. If the vice or the instinct to the vice is so universal, ought it to be condemned as a vice at all? Ought it even to be thought of as wrong in any way, let alone as constituting a deadly wrong? So far as I know, the classic argument against the condemnation of lust is twofold, coming on the one hand from people who regard religious prohibitions as part of an outworn phase of the human spirit, and on the other from people who respect and adhere to religion but question the balance of its teaching. The first argument proceeds roughly as follows. Lust can be avoided only by an unnaturally powerful act of will. The fact that this act of will is against inclination inevitably results in harmful psychological strain and, as often as not, in a search for animal satisfactions outside the regions of sex, for example, in aggressiveness or a brutal use of power, in activities which are far more harmful than the imagined wrongs of incontinence. Furthermore, it is argued to see wrong in sexual freedom is to see wrong in the order of nature, is to deny the beauty of the creation, and therefore, if you believe in God, is to deny the Creator's goodness and perfection. It is a blasphemy against life. The second argument, while accepting the religious prohibition in general, objects to the enormous prominence given in church teaching to lust. As in the previous argument, the great demand made upon the will is blamed as excessive. It is objected that a person who succeeds in the effort of leading a chaste life may often, except in circumstances of rare felicity, use up all moral energy in doing so. He or she will have none left for the first and great commandment, or for loving one's neighbor as oneself. Hence, the by no means rare phenomenon of the upright churchgoer with an unblemished name and a heart of flint. Could anyone be remoter from the teaching of the New Testament? The moral teaching of Christianity is not adjured, according to this line of argument, but the heavy stress on the wickedness of erotic misconduct is held to be mistaken. Such are the two most usual arguments against the prohibition. What are the arguments on the other side? The usual one against sexual freedom is that such a proposal both underrates and exaggerates the importance of the erotic instincts. To take the exaggeration first, the belief that sex is the mainspring of human activity It must therefore not be bent too much by the will. This commonly accepted notion, based on vulgarizations of modern psychological theory, is contested on the grounds that it is not supported by ordinary evidence. Though it is not a thing much mentioned in the papers, large numbers of people, probably the majority, appear content with sexual activity within the limits of the law. Total abstinence from sex, practiced with no harmful effect, by well-adjusted people is by no means uncommon. Scandals involving unmarried clergy or nuns are rare events. The belief that continence provokes extra sexual misconduct does not rest on any self-evident truth. With exceptions, criminals, both of the law-abiding and the law-breaking kind, are not remarkable for chastity. There is no reason at all to suppose that sexual repression is a main cause of crime. Equally, there is no reason to suppose that sexual liberation leads to an earthly paradise whose inhabitants lose all cruel impulse and dwell together in peace and bliss. The few societies, such as the Scandinavian or Japanese, which may be described as sexually free by usual standards, do not seem to have automatically solved the riddles of human happiness and right behavior. The evidence is that sexual freedom either has no improving effect or causes at least as many problems as it solves. It is here that the argument against underrating, is it underrating? Yeah. Sexual instinct comes in. The argument is simple. Pardon for my jumbling there. The argument is simple, more ancient than history, and usually expressed in theological terms. To use profane terms, it may be roughly expressed as follows. Man depends for the bare minimum maintenance of his human status on the orderly and partial inhibition of the numerous passions which he shares with the animals. He naturally rebels against inhibition, as a tethered animal does. But this rebellious passion must also be inhibited along with the rest. Total inhibition must never be compelled, but to reject the partial inhibitions of sacred or profane law is to reject far more than the freedom marchers guess, for the whole idea of inhibition involves the immense question whether man is merely another animal or something more. The circumstances of civilized life today offer new material for this line of argument with reference to lust. In most times and places, the practice of lust is regarded as a masculine preserve from which women are excluded on pain of severe and sometimes frightful punishments. But now, with female emancipation, this kind of sex inequality, though still largely accepted, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The sauce for the gander can now be claimed by the goose, and often is. A noted French authoress has taken the matter to its logical conclusion and advocates officially licensed brothels for the use of female clients. Without such institutions, she asserts, sex equality is a sham. Her proposal is likely to shock many people who regard themselves as unshockable, and perhaps one reason is that it forcibly brings out the main argument in favor of anti-lust legislation and the more alarming implications of the pro-lust agitation. For, of course, the whole idea that men and women are sexually on equal terms is ridiculous. This is not seriously disputed, though it is often overlooked, that as a result of sexual inequality of function, there is a corresponding inequality in the means of sexual satisfaction. For many men, sexual congress and love completely suffices, but as has been pointed out by authorities deserving respect, this is not so generally the case with women. Normally, they achieve full sexual satisfaction through motherhood and nursing as well as through congress. The emotion of fatherhood, though sexual, essentially unconnected with physical sex experience. If monogamy is considered too harsh a condition for men and women, if both sexes have equal rights, then it would seem from the foregoing that the correct thing to aim for is a large bastard population. This might result in many unpredictable social evils, including chronic and fanatical class conflict between the legitimately and illegitimately born. The final result might well be the complete abolition of marriage and a family background to life. Though extreme, this ultimate development is not impossible. Marriage gets a bad press all around today, and the fact that by British revenue arrangements it is subject to penal taxation raises no protest from thinkers. Politicians, the electorate, or the churches, in many of the most civilized parts of the world, it is an enfeebled institution. This is, of course, to speak of monogamous marriage as if it were the only known kind. Legalized polygamy, including polyandry, has been and is practiced successfully in many parts of the world. This is encouraging, is it not? Why not try it here? I have not learned enough to range a host of authorities for or against the polygamous system, but it seems incontestable that although polygamy has operated successfully for long periods, it is in reality a short-term solution. It seems to be an acceptable way of life for people in a state of civilization cruder than our own. In Islamic countries where male polygamy remains legal, it has for long been rejected by the more educated, and this is not just due to the monogamous influence of Europe. One is tempted to say that Islamic polygamy depended on an enslaved female population, but I think that this is in some part a popular fallacy. Eastern women, especially in tribal areas, were never the enslaved creatures of European fancy, and the enslavement theory can hardly be true of polyandry in the few areas where it is practiced. It is certainly true, however, that educated and emancipated women make harem life impossible, and it seems safe to say that most well-educated men of virile temperament would not find the discipline of polyandry agreeable. The evidence is that if we agree to travel along the road of civilized progress, there comes a moment when we have to say goodbye to the consolations of multiple marriage. In its place, we can put frequent divorce, a cause of unhappy childhood everywhere, and a frequent cause of child beggary in poor countries where divorce is easy. But there seems to be no other possible compromise between monogamy and a measure of freedom that would transform and probably destroy our fragile civilization. Against the numerous but less vocal rebels who accept Christian teaching in the main, but question the extreme church condemnation of lust, the argument is necessarily less general. Clergymen point out that the compassion of Jesus Christ to unchaste sinners involved no commiseration of inchastity, that the famous utterance, "Her sins are forgiven, but forgiven her, for she has loved much," refers to sacred love and not, as is often believed, to profane love, and that Christ's positive teaching on chastity is extremely severe, as in his prohibition against lustful ideas regardless of action, and in the idea of those who renounce all sexual pleasure. For the kingdom of heaven's sake. In fact, moralists may conclude that the supposed gospel leniency to inchastity is conveniently imagined. Is it? In part, perhaps, but the extraordinary fact remains that Jesus Christ not only met, but made friends with harlots, and is only once recorded to have spoken a harsh word to a loose liver, the woman of Samaria, and then in the course of a courteous dialogue which resulted in instant conversion. He told no parable on the subject of chastity. The foolish virgins were virgins, and his harshest denunciation of inchastity is mild compared to what he had to say on the subject of hypocrisy, hardness of heart, and the parade of respectability by the spiritually vain. Why does the church not put the stress here rather than on sins of the flesh? Why not call hypocrisy deadly rather than lust? I'll tell you one reason why is because hypocrisy usually doesn't beget bastard children or children to begin with. I mean, that's probably the main reason. If I were a clergyman, I should not enjoy countering that undoubtedly strong argument. But if I were a clergyman and had to somehow, I should point to a certain misunderstanding about the 7 deadly sins. They were originally called capital sins, and the meaning, as I understand it, is not that they are more ghastly than any others, but that indulgence in them involves the sinner in many other sins besides. Each one is the capital, so to speak, of a whole territory of mischief and wrongdoing. In the case of lust, it may be argued, if the compassion of Jesus Christ is translated into terms of tolerance, the primrose path thereby open must lead first to an increase of such horrors as brothel slavery, and ultimately to the deathly state of animal degradation that moralists foresee from the total sex freedom advocated by certain of the non-religious. So far, I've referred to familiar arguments on both sides, but of recent years, a new and disturbing opposition to traditional morals has arisen. This comes from a school of ideas which has been described as a new romanticism. Followers of this movement see delusion in every human pretension, and their culture is anti-art. I believe that the school is still too unformed to be indicated with precision, but the answer of this vanguard to the prohibitors is not in much doubt and would go roughly as follows. What you say against lust has not the slightest force, because it originates in gigantic lies, in postulating that the moral sense is rational, that there is such a thing as reason, that individual men have some animal property or other, call it soul, ugh, or that the collective spirit of man, which the less orthodox prefer to these individual souls of yours, is inherently superior to the collective spirit of pigs, slugs, trees, or cabbage, if one likes to imagine anything so blatantly non-existent as a spirit of any kind at all. Man, the paragon, is an invention of our forefathers' vanity. You invite a choice between ape and angel, apes forever. What's wrong with them? Plenty, but at least they exist, and a regular ape is worth 1,000 disguised apes trying to look like non-existent angels. And regular apes, as opposed to your fancy dress variety, see nothing wrong in lust, if only for the very good reason that they have no wish to be human beings. Man is obsolete. The last sentence is a quotation. I think I see the counter argument. The weakness of this new school of no humanism, no morality, no reason, no art, is surely that its argument depends on an appeal to those moral values which it rejects, notably the love of truth. If I am not mistaken, its followers are in the same philosophical jam as plagues the behaviorists, of whom Aldous Huxley wisely remarked that if their belief in behaviorism is sound, then there is no reason to attach importance to anything a behaviorist may say. In these reflections, I have not given much of my own view. Haven't I got one? All the world loves a lover, don't you? Of course I do. I have known many people whom you could call lovers and whom I have loved. By no stretch of the imagination can I feel personally condemnatory on the subject. All the same, I will go with the moralist in not loving Don Juan. He seems to be merely the inverse of the flinty-hearted Pharisee, all the mental and moral energy used up in the strenuous play of seduction. In the few of the species whom I have known, I notice one characteristic in common: an ineradicable vulgarity, an essential commonness of mind. Off their beat, they are dull dogs. I suppose the coarseness of the character in these people provides striking evidence that the notion of the capital sin commanding subsidiaries has great psychological depth. Promiscuous love necessitates hypocrisy. To play the part of Don Juan, you need to be word perfect, and that of Tartuffe as well. Or is it Tartuffe? Philistine I am. That was much longer than I expected it to be. 19 minutes. Well, one more chapter remains, and I hope I don't botch it as bad as I did that last one. Goodbye. Goodbye, bruv.